Story 1, The Doll. It was Halloween night, but not the kind filled with laughter and candy. The neighborhood had gone quiet, the last trick-or-treaters having retreated to their homes hours ago. Even our notoriously festive neighbors across the street had finally turned off their corny Halloween sound effects. The creaking doors, cackling witches, and howling winds that had played on loop since dusk. The clock was edging close to midnight. The only light in our living room came from the dim glow of my laptop screen and the small lamp beside my cousin Q, who was tapping away at her keyboard, seemingly unbothered by the eerie silence that had settled around us. My 4-year-old cousin had left her doll lying face down on the carpet before being carried off to bed earlier that evening. It was one of those baby-live dolls, the kind with mechanical eyelids that open and close to simulate sleep. The doll's empty glass eyes stared lifelessly at the floor, its plastic limbs splayed in an unnatural position. Q hated that doll from the moment it entered our house. "That thing is creepy as hell," she'd whisper whenever the little one played with it. Sometimes I'd catch Q throwing it down the basement stairs when no one was looking. I never understood her aversion. It was just a doll, albeit a slightly uncanny one with its two real features. We had been sitting in silence for nearly half an hour when the first sound came. A harsh, rasping noise scraped through the quiet of the living room. It was a wet, throaty sound, like an elderly man struggling to breathe, and it seemed to be coming from just outside our window. I turned to Q, my body suddenly rigid. "Did you hear that?" She glanced up from her screen, her fingers pausing mid-type. "It's probably the neighbor's tape again," she muttered, though I could see the tension in her shoulders. After a moment, she resumed typing, the click-clack of her keyboard cutting through the renewed silence. A minute passed. Then the rasping came again, louder this time. It sounded like the man was trying to form words, his voice scratching against the stillness of the night. I rose from the couch, my heartbeat quickening as I approached the window. Pulling back the curtain, I peered into the darkness. The street was empty. No movement, no shadowy figures. Our neighbor's house stood dark and silent across the way. "There's no one out there," I said, turning back to Q. She didn't respond, but I noticed her typing had slowed considerably. Another minute crawled by, each second stretching longer than it should. Then we heard it again, not the rasping this time, but whispering. Loud, urgent whispering that sounded like a mixture of a child's voice and a woman's, their words overlapping in a discordant jumble that made my skin crawl. Q finally looked up from her computer, her face pale in the blue glow of her screen. "It's that doll," she said, her voice barely audible. I scoffed, though the tremor in my laugh betrayed my unease. "Don't be ridiculous. I've never believed in the paranormal. Ghosts, demons, possessed objects. Those were just stories people told to explain the unexplainable. And yet as I bent down to pick up the doll from the floor, I couldn't ignore the cold dread pooling in my stomach. The doll was heavier than I remembered, its plastic body unnaturally warm to the touch. I turned it over in my hands and my breath caught in my throat. Its eyes were open, wide open, though I distinctly remembered them being closed when I'd glanced at it earlier. "See?" Q hissed, pushing back from her desk. "I told you that thing was evil." I dropped the doll like it had burned me, and Q immediately kicked it across the room, sending it tumbling down the basement stairs with a series of hollow thuds. We didn't speak about what happened for the rest of the night. Q denied it ever happened in the morning, and my little cousin never asked about her doll again. I think she sensed something was off about it too. A week later, I had to go down to the basement to get some tools for my uncle. As I descended the creaking wooden steps, my flashlight beam swept across the concrete floor. And there it was. The doll was perched on the bottom step, not where it had landed after Q kicked it down, but sitting upright, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Its glassy eyes seemed to follow my movement, and its rosebud mouth, once fixed in a pleasant smile, now looked twisted and mocking. I only saw the doll one more time after that day. It was a month later, and I was heading down to the basement to grab some winter clothes. I froze on the top step. The doll was there, not at the bottom of the stairs this time, but on the first step, as if it had been slowly climbing its way back up. Its painted face was smeared, the once rosy cheeks now streaked with what looked like dirt or something darker. Its dress, previously pristine white, was stained and torn. But what frightened me most were its eyes. One was missing entirely, leaving a hollow black socket that seemed to stare right through me. I didn't hesitate this time. I kicked it back down the stairs harder than Q had and watched as it hit the concrete floor with a crack. Then I slammed the basement door shut and wedged a chair under the handle. We moved out of that house 3 months later for unrelated reasons. Or at least, that's what my aunt and uncle claimed. But sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I still hear that rasping whisper in my dreams. And I wake up with the unshakable feeling that somewhere, in the darkness at the foot of my bed, something is watching me with one glass eye. Story 2. The Window Watcher. I've always loved the solitude of living alone in the woods, the way the trees whisper secrets to each other on windy nights, the absence of prying neighbors and traffic noise, the freedom to exist in my own space without judgment or interruption. That's why I chose this house, a small single-story cabin nestled among towering pines on the outskirts of town. One of my favorite features was the abundance of large windows. I'd never bothered with blinds or curtains. There was simply no need. My property was secluded enough that the closest neighbor was nearly half a mile away, and the dense tree line provided all the privacy I required. Plus, I loved waking up to unfiltered sunlight streaming across my bedroom, painting warm rectangles on the hardwood floor. That was before the knocking began. It was a cold, moonless night in late October, the kind where the darkness feels absolute, like it could swallow you whole if you stared into it too long. I was up late, reading in bed, the soft glow of my bedside lamp creating a small island of light in my otherwise darkened bedroom. The house was silent except for the occasional settling creak and the gentle rustling of pages as I turned them. I had just decided to call it a night when I heard it. A single distinct tap against my bedroom window. Tap, like a knuckle against glass. I froze, my finger hovering over the lamp switch. The sound had been deliberate, unmistakable, not the random patter of rain or the brush of a tree branch. A knock. I was facing away from the window, and an inexplicable dread kept me from turning around. Instead, I remained perfectly still, ears straining in the silence, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination or some natural occurrence I could easily explain away. 2 minutes passed in agonizing slowness before I heard it again. Tap. Still a single knock, but more confident this time. Purposeful. My heart hammered against my ribs. I tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was just some neighborhood kid playing a prank. But deep down, I knew that made no sense. My home was too isolated for casual mischief makers. Someone would have had to deliberately trek through the woods in pitch darkness to reach my window. I told myself if I ignored it, whoever, or whatever, was out there would eventually give up and leave. So I stayed motionless, barely breathing, as if by remaining still I could somehow become invisible. The third knock came after another minute. Tap, this time followed by a soft scratching sound, like fingernails trailing across the glass. The fourth knock broke my resolve. Tap. I had to confront this, face my fear like an adult. With a deep breath, I spun around to face the window, prepared to shout at whatever prankster had decided to torment me. But all I caught was a glimpse of something dark ducking quickly beneath the windowsill, a shadow moving with unnatural speed, human-shaped but somehow wrong in its proportions. Any courage I had mustered evaporated instantly. I bolted from my bed and ran to the kitchen, fumbling for the phone with trembling hands. As I dialed for the police, I happened to glance up at the kitchen window and saw a face staring back at me. It was only visible for a split second before it disappeared from view, but that brief image burned itself into my memory. A gaunt face, unnaturally pale in the moonlight, with eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. Not the face of some troublemaking teenager, but of someone, something, much older and filled with malice. While I was stammering my address to the emergency dispatcher, my phone rang with an incoming call. It was my neighbor, Mark, the only person who lived somewhat nearby. "I was just letting the dog out," he said, his voice tight with worry, "and I saw 3 people walking onto your property, all dressed in black. One of them had something shiny in his hand, a knife maybe. Are you okay?" My blood turned to ice. "Call the police," I managed to whisper, though I'd already done the same. "They're already on their way," he assured me. I thanked him and hung up, then ran upstairs to the bathroom, the only room in my house without windows, and locked myself inside. Every few seconds I heard a single knock from different parts of the house. Tap at the living room window, tap at the back door, tap tap at the side window near the stairs. They were surrounding the house, testing every possible entrance. Then the knocking at the front door became more insistent. A heavy, authoritative pounding followed by a voice shouting, "Police, open up!" Relief flooded through me as I ran downstairs. The officers searched the property thoroughly, but found no sign of intruders. Only fresh footprints in the soft earth around my house, circling it completely, and strange symbols carved into the bark of several trees at the edge of my property. The police increased patrols in my area for the next few weeks, but whoever had been watching me that night never returned, at least not that I know of. I installed motion sensor lights, security cameras, and heavy-duty blinds on every window the very next day. But here's the thing about blinds. You have to close them for them to work. And sometimes, late at night, when I think no one's watching, I'll leave them open just a crack to let in the cool night air. It was during one of these moments, nearly a month after the incident, that I noticed something, a faint reflection in my bedroom mirror, not of my own face, but of my window. And there, just visible in the narrow gap between the blinds, was the unmistakable gleam of eyes watching me from the darkness, waiting patiently, as if they'd been there all along. I don't leave my blinds open anymore, not even a crack. And sometimes when the wind is still and the night is at its darkest, I can hear it, a soft, almost gentle tapping, moving methodically from window to window around my house. Tap, 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 like someone patiently checking each entrance, knowing that eventually I'll make a mistake, and they'll finally find their way in. Story 3. The Creep. When you're 12 and your parents are divorced, you'll do almost anything to escape the suffocating silence of a half-empty house. That's what drove me outside on my bike every day that summer, pedaling aimlessly through sun-drenched suburban streets, looking for some distraction from the hollow feeling that had taken up residence in my chest since Mom left. That's how I met Tom. He lived on the corner of my block in a small, weathered house with peeling paint and overgrown grass. I'd passed by it dozens of times without giving it a second thought, until that sweltering July afternoon when I noticed someone watching me from the driveway. "Hey," he called out, raising his hand in a casual wave. "Want to shoot some hoops?" Tom was 16, tall and lanky, with a mop of dark hair that fell across his eyes. He had a basketball hoop mounted above his garage door and a lopsided smile that seemed friendly enough. I was desperate for company, so I agreed. We played for hours that first day. He was better than me, obviously, but he never made me feel bad about it. We talked about video games, complained about school, and discovered we had something significant in common. We were both only children living with our fathers. "My mom couldn't handle it anymore," Tom said with a shrug when I cautiously brought up the topic of parents. "Just packed her bags one day and never came back." The way he said it, so matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather, made me feel like maybe my own situation wasn't so unusual after all. I gave him my phone number before I left, and for the first few weeks, everything was fine. We'd hang out, play video games at my place, or shoot hoops at his. I thought I'd made a real friend. Then things started getting strange. It began with the phone calls. If I didn't answer right away, Tom would call again, and again, and again, sometimes 5 or 6 times in a row. He'd leave increasingly agitated voicemails, his voice shifting from casual to tense with each unanswered call. "Hey, it's Tom, call me back." "Dude, why aren't you answering?" "I know you're there, pick up the phone." "What's your problem? Are you ignoring me?" When he wasn't calling, he was showing up unannounced at my front door. If my dad was home, he'd force me to hang out with Tom despite my growing reluctance. "He seems like a nice kid," Dad would say, "and he doesn't have many friends. Be nice." But Tom wasn't nice. Not really. The more time I spent with him, the more I noticed how his eyes would follow me around the room, how he'd memorize details about my life that I'd only mentioned in passing, how he'd mimic my mannerisms and adopt my phrases. It was like he was studying me, trying to become me. One afternoon in August, after a particularly persistent series of phone calls, I finally gave in and biked over to Tom's house. He was waiting for me in the driveway, practically bouncing with excitement. "I've got something cool to show you," he said, his eyes gleaming with an intensity that made my stomach knot. Inside. In all the weeks we'd known each other, I'd never actually been inside Tom's house. We'd always stayed in the driveway or the backyard. Something about the way he was looking at me now, eager, almost hungry, set off alarm bells in my head. "I don't know, man," I hedged. "It's getting late." "It'll only take a minute," he insisted, already moving towards the front door. "Come on." I followed him reluctantly, my sense of dread growing with each step. The stench hit me the moment the door swung open, a vile cocktail of rotting food, unwashed bodies, and something else underneath. Something sickly sweet and putrid. The living room was a disaster zone. Clothes were strewn across every surface, dishes crusted with moldy food balanced in precarious stacks, and dark stains splattered one wall like someone had thrown coffee at it. But it wasn't coffee. Even at 12, I knew it wasn't coffee. A massive shadow detached itself from the hallway. Tom's father was an enormous man, his bulk filling the narrow space as he shambled into view. His face was covered in a patchy beard, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. He fixed those dead eyes on me, and I instinctively stepped backward. "This is my friend," Tom said, his voice suddenly higher, more childlike. His father didn't respond, just grunted and retreated into another room. The look he'd given me, though, predatory, calculating, made my skin crawl. "I need to go," I said, no longer caring if I seemed rude. "I forgot I have a doctor's appointment today." Tom's reaction was immediate and disturbing. The friendly mask he'd worn slipped away, revealing something cold and alien beneath. His smile faded into a tight line, his eyes narrowing to slits. He didn't speak, just stared at me with such naked hostility that I backed towards the door. I ran all the way home, not looking back once. The house was empty when I arrived, a note stuck to the fridge informing me that Dad had been called in to work because of a storm emergency. I was alone. That night, before going to bed, I checked my email. Instead of the eBay response I'd been waiting for, I found 5 new messages in my inbox, all from an address I didn't recognize. TomTom28@AOL.com. I never gave Tom my email address. The subject lines made my blood freeze. "You made a mistake. I know where you live. You can't hide from me. You're going to pay. Check your window." My bedroom was on the 2nd floor, but as I read that last subject line, I heard a sound from outside, the unmistakable rustle of someone moving through the bushes beneath my window. My hands shaking, I crossed the room and carefully parted the blinds. Tom's father stared back at me, his face inches from the glass, eyes gleaming in the darkness. I stumbled backward, knocking over my desk lamp as I lunged for the phone. By the time the police arrived 20 minutes later, he was gone. But he'd left something behind. A small stack of Polaroid photographs on my windowsill, showing me on my bike, me playing video games in my living room, me sleeping in my bed. They'd been watching me for weeks. The restraining order took effect immediately. Tom and his father moved away a month later, in the middle of the night, according to the neighbors. The house stood vacant for years afterward, no one willing to buy a property with such a disturbing history. I stayed inside that whole month, jumping at shadows and sleeping with my desk chair jammed under my doorknob. Dad installed a security system, but it didn't help much. Some kinds of fear get under your skin and stay there. I'm 28 now, living in another state, but I still check my email spam folder compulsively. I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, certain I've heard rustling beneath my window, and I still flinch when I see someone who resembles Tom. That same hungry look, like they're trying to find someone they can become. Because the truly terrifying thing isn't what happened. It's what could have happened if I'd stayed in that house a moment longer. Story 4. The Beer Thief. The house never felt quite right from the beginning. My aunt and uncle had rented it out for years after building their new place across town. But there was something about its layout, the awkward additions, the strange angles of the hallways, the way sound carried through certain rooms but died completely in others, that always left me slightly unsettled. Still, the price was right, and beggars can't be choosers when you're 25 with mediocre credit and a job that pays just enough to keep you afloat. I lived alone for the first few months, filling the empty spaces with second-hand furniture, and telling myself the odd noises at night were just the house settling. When Mark from work mentioned he needed a place to stay, it seemed like the perfect solution. Split the rent, have some company, maybe even feel a little safer in a house that never quite felt empty even when I was the only one there. Mark was a decent enough roommate. We worked different shifts. I was days, he was nights, so we rarely got in each other's way. He took one look at the 2 adjacent bedrooms and decided he wanted his own space, converting the office in the garage into what he called his bachelor pad. It was a smart setup, I had to admit. He'd installed a mini fridge, a TV, even brought in a futon and some decent speakers. The only downside was the lack of a bathroom or kitchen out there, which meant he still had to come into the main house several times a day. Because of our opposing schedules, I often left the house unlocked for him. Not the safest choice, maybe, but we lived in a decent neighborhood, and the alternative was him waking me up at 3 a.m. when he got home from his shift. That was our arrangement for nearly 6 months, and it worked well enough until the night of the beer. I'd spent the evening at my girlfriend's place, arriving home around midnight with a 6-pack of craft IPA I'd splurged on. I placed it carefully in the fridge, anticipating enjoying it the following evening after a particularly brutal shift I knew was coming. When I got home the next night, exhausted and craving that first cold sip, I swung open the refrigerator door to find nothing. My beer was gone. The rage was immediate and disproportionate, the culmination of a terrible day, exhaustion and the specific disappointment that comes from looking forward to something small, only to have it snatched away. I stormed out to the garage, slamming open Mark's door without knocking. He was asleep, rolling over with a startled grunt as light from the hallway fell across his face. "What the hell, man?" I demanded, not caring that I'd woken him. "Why would you drink my beer without asking?" Mark blinked away sleep, his confusion appearing genuine. "What beer? I didn't touch anything of yours." I stared at him hard, searching for signs of deception. After living with someone for months, you develop a sense for their tells. Mark was a terrible liar. He'd scratch the side of his nose, avoid eye contact, speak faster than normal. He was doing none of those things. The anger drained away, replaced by a creeping dread that crawled up my spine. If Mark hadn't taken my beer... "Someone's been in the house," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. We rushed back inside, suddenly alert to every shadow, every unfamiliar creak of the floorboards. The living room looked untouched, TV still mounted on the wall, gaming consoles underneath. My collection of vinyl records intact beside the turntable. It wasn't until I reached my bedroom that the violation became clear. My laptop, a $2,200 MacBook Pro I'd saved for months to buy, was gone from my desk. Mark called the police while I frantically searched the house, hoping against hope that I'd simply misplaced it. But the more we looked, the more certain we became that someone had been inside while we were both away. They'd taken my beer as a casual afterthought, a refreshment while they perused our belongings for more valuable items. As we waited for the police, a sick feeling of vulnerability settling in my stomach, I remembered something crucial about the house, something I'd learned when I first moved in but had filed away as unimportant. We weren't alone in this house, and I don't mean in a supernatural sense. When my aunt and uncle had originally owned the place, they'd built an additional room onto the back of the property for my aunt's mother, who spent her final years living there. It had its own entrance and was essentially a small apartment. Bedroom, bathroom, kitchenette. After her death, they'd rented it out to a woman who, for reasons I never fully understood, had been allowed to stay even after my aunt and uncle began renting out the main house. She'd been there when I moved in, a thin, nervous woman in her 40s who I rarely saw. About 3 months into my tenancy, her brother had moved in with her, supposedly temporarily. He was even more elusive than she was, a hulking shadow who would smoke cigarettes in the shared backyard and never acknowledge my greetings. Once, he'd approached Mark and asked if he could score some product, his eyes darting around nervously, pupils like pinpoints. Mark had turned him down flat and warned me afterward that both siblings were likely addicts. As this realization crystallized, Mark and I stepped outside to check the yard. There, in the fresh snow that had fallen earlier that evening, were bare footprints leading from their private entrance to our garage door. The implications sent ice through my veins. Someone had walked barefoot through freezing snow to enter our home. Not a random burglar, but someone who knew our routines, who had watched us coming and going, who knew when the house would be empty. We pounded on their door, shouting that we knew what they'd done. A curtain twitched, and for a split second I locked eyes with the brother through the window. A gaze so empty and cold it felt like looking into a void. Then the curtain fell back into place, and there was only silence. The police arrived 20 minutes later, took our statements, and searched the property half-heartedly. They found the footprints interesting but not conclusive. When they ran the siblings' names through their system, however, their demeanor changed. The brother, it turned out, had a warrant in another state for breaking and entering, among other charges. But here was the catch. Since the warrant was out of state and they hadn't caught him in the act, there wasn't much they could do except file a report and advise us to be vigilant. They knocked on the siblings' door for several minutes, identifying themselves as police, but no one answered. After they left, the house felt impossibly silent and threateningly alive all at once. Mark and I retreated to our respective rooms, locking doors behind us despite being under the same roof. What I hadn't remembered until I was lying in bed, staring at my ceiling at 1 a.m., was that the door connecting the siblings' apartment to our part of the house could only be locked from their side. I'd forgotten to check it. Sometime deep in the night, I woke to footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. Soft but deliberate, they paused outside my door. Then came 3 loud knocks, followed by the violent rattling of my doorknob, metal scraping against metal as someone tried to force their way in. I lay frozen under my blankets, breath caught in my throat, as the knob twisted back and forth with increasing force. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the attempts stopped. The footsteps retreated down the hall. The next morning, hollow-eyed from a night without sleep, I asked Mark if he'd tried to come into my room during the night. "I slept like the dead," he said, pouring himself coffee. "Didn't even get up to pee." We moved out 2 weeks later, breaking our lease and forfeiting our security deposit in the process. It seemed a small price to pay. To this day, I lock my bedroom door at night, a habit born from what could have happened if that lock had failed. And sometimes, when I'm drifting off to sleep, I imagine I hear footsteps approaching, soft but deliberate, pausing just outside my door. Story 5. The Creepy Man. Jason's 21st birthday party was in full swing by the time I arrived around 10 p.m. The modest two-story house was pulsing with music, the air thick with the mingled scents of spilled beer, cologne, and sweat. Bodies pressed against each other in the living room turned dance floor, red Solo cups clutched in hands, voices raised to be heard over the thudding bass. I didn't know half the people there. Jason had invited his work friends, his gym buddies, his cousins from out of town, a chaotic blend of strangers united only by their connection to the birthday boy. I pushed my way through the crowd, searching for familiar faces, when my gaze landed on him. The man in the corner. He was at least 40 years older than anyone else at the party, his weathered face a stark contrast to the youthful energy surrounding him. While everyone else mingled and moved, he remained perfectly still, perched on a folding chair in the darkest corner of the living room. He wasn't drinking, wasn't talking to anyone. He was just watching. His eyes moved methodically across the room, studying each person with an unsettling intensity before moving on to the next. When his gaze briefly met mine, I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. There was something wrong about those eyes. Too focused, too calculating. I turned away, spotting my friend Derek by the makeshift bar in the kitchen. "Hey," I said, nudging him. "Who's the old guy in the corner?" Derek glanced over, brows furrowing. "What old guy?" "The one sitting alone by the bookshelf, gray hair, brown jacket." Derek shrugged after a moment. "No idea, probably someone's dad or uncle. Jason's got a big family." I tried to dismiss my unease, throwing myself into the celebration. As the night wore on, people began to leave in small groups, the crowd thinning as 2 a.m. approached. Through it all, the man remained in his corner, never shifting position except to turn his head, never speaking to anyone. By 3 in the morning, only a handful of us remained. Myself, Derek, our friends Alex and Mia, and Jason himself, all sprawled across couches in the living room, riding the wave between drunk and hungover. The man in the corner was gone, having slipped away unnoticed sometime during the exodus. "Thank God that creepy dude finally left," I said, accepting a glass of water from Jason. "What creepy dude?" Jason asked, dropping onto the adjacent couch. "The older guy who was sitting in the corner all night, staring at everyone." Jason and Derek exchanged a look. "Dude," Jason said slowly, "I didn't invite any older men. Everyone here was either from work, the gym, or college. Maybe he was a neighbor who got annoyed with the noise and came to check it out," Alex suggested, but I knew that wasn't it. The man hadn't seemed annoyed or out of place. He'd seemed purposeful, like he was exactly where he meant to be. We decided to crash at Jason's rather than drive home drunk. Derek, Alex, and Mia took the upstairs bedrooms, while Jason passed out on one couch in the living room. I took the smaller couch in the den downstairs, a blanket thrown haphazardly over me, the alcohol in my system pulling me quickly toward unconsciousness. I woke sometime later, my mouth desert dry and my bladder painfully full. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. My phone told me it was 4:37 a.m. I stumbled to the bathroom first, then made my way up to the kitchen for water, navigating by the dim glow of the microwave clock. Glass in hand, I shuffled back down to the den, my eyes still heavy with sleep. That's when I noticed it. The sliding closet door across from the couch was open about 6 inches. I was certain it had been closed when I'd fallen asleep. A chill that had nothing to do with the house's temperature crawled up my spine as I remembered the man from the party. Had he been watching me all this time? Had he been hiding, waiting for everyone to fall asleep? I stood frozen, staring at that sliver of darkness, unable to see anything inside but acutely aware that someone could be watching me through that gap. The longer I stared, the more certain I became that there were eyes in that darkness, regarding me with the same clinical interest I'd noticed earlier. The closet door slid open another inch, the movement so subtle I might have imagined it if not for the whisper of wood against track. Fear galvanized me into action. I lunged over the adjacent couch and bolted up the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. Behind me, I heard the unmistakable sound of the closet door sliding fully open, followed by rapid footsteps pursuing me. "Wake up!" I screamed as I reached the living room where Jason was sleeping. "Someone's in the house!" Jason jolted awake, along with Derek and Alex, who had been sleeping on the other couches. Mia emerged from the hallway, rubbing her eyes in confusion. "What the hell are you talking about?" Derek demanded, his voice thick with sleep. "The man from the party," I gasped, pointing toward the stairway I'd just ascended. "He was hiding in the downstairs closet. He just came after me." The 4 of them stared at me with expressions ranging from concern to annoyance, clearly believing I was either drunk or having a nightmare. But then we all froze as we heard the unmistakable sound of the back door opening and closing from downstairs in the den. "Call the cops," Alex whispered, suddenly alert. Jason grabbed his phone and dialed 911 while Derek and Alex moved cautiously toward the staircase. I stood rooted to the spot, my heart hammering so violently I thought it might burst from my chest. We waited in tense silence for nearly 15 minutes before the police arrived. They searched the entire property but found no sign of an intruder other than the open back door, which could have been left unlocked during the party. "Are you sure you saw someone?" the officer asked me, his skepticism barely concealed. "Sometimes after a night of drinking." "I know what I saw," I interrupted, though I was beginning to doubt myself. "There was a man at the party watching everyone. No one knew who he was. Then he was hiding in the closet downstairs." The officers exchanged a glance I couldn't interpret. One of them jotted something in his notebook before assuring us they'd drive by the house periodically for the rest of the night. After they left, my friends were unusually quiet. "Look," Jason finally said, "we've all had too much to drink. Let's just try to get some sleep. You can crash up here with us instead of going back downstairs." I nodded gratefully, though sleep was the furthest thing from my mind. We arranged ourselves around the living room, lights left on, the TV playing quietly for comfort. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake the image of that man's eyes watching me from the darkness of the closet. The next morning, in the harsh light of day, I almost convinced myself it had been a hallucination, until Jason pulled me aside as I was preparing to leave. "I didn't want to say anything in front of the others," he said in a low voice, "but my roommate mentioned something weird a couple of weeks ago. He thought he saw someone looking in through our kitchen window late one night. We wrote it off as his imagination." A chill ran through me. "Did he describe who he saw?" Jason hesitated. "An older man, gray hair, just standing there staring in. I never went back to that house again. And to this day, I can't stand closets with sliding doors. Those narrow gaps where darkness pools, where eyes might be watching, waiting for your guard to drop. Because sometimes the monsters at parties aren't the ones making noise. Sometimes they're the silent ones in the corner, the ones who stay until everyone else has gone, the ones who find a dark place to hide and wait for the perfect moment to emerge. Sometimes they're still there, even after you think they're gone." Story 6. The Creepy Girl. North Carolina summers are brutal, the air so thick with humidity it feels like breathing through a wet cloth. Working retail during those months is its own special hell. Fluorescent lights, recycled air, and the constant flow of customers tracking in heat from the outside world. But as a college student on break, I didn't have many options, so I took the night shift at TJ Maxx, grateful for the extra $1 per hour they offered for closing. Our store was located in one of those sprawling shopping centers that populate the outskirts of college towns, a concrete island surrounded by a vast parking lot that emptied quickly after 9 p.m. By 11 p.m., when we locked the doors and began counting registers, the lot would be nearly deserted except for our cars clustered in the employee section. The store had a strict safety protocol. All closing employees had to leave together with a security guard, a retired cop named Ray, watching from the sidewalk until we reached our vehicles. It seemed excessive to me at first, but after a few late shifts, I began to appreciate the precaution. There was something unsettling about that empty parking lot, the way the shadows pooled between the few working lights, how sounds carried across the asphalt with unnatural clarity. It was a Tuesday night in July, about 11:30 p.m. when it happened. I just finished my shift and was walking toward my car, a beat-up Honda that had seen better days, keys already in hand. Ray stood at his usual post near the entrance, his bulky silhouette reassuring against the darkened storefront. The air was still oppressively warm, pressing down like a physical weight. I heard the car before I saw it, a low engine rumble breaking the silence as headlights swept across the lot. It was unusual to see anyone else at this hour, but I didn't think much of it until the vehicle began to slow as it approached me. It was an older model sedan, once white but now a dingy gray, with a cracked windshield and rust eating at the wheel wells. The car pulled up alongside me, engine idling roughly and the driver's window rolled down with a manual crank. A woman leaned across the passenger seat to address me. She was in her 40s, maybe early 50s, with lank hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and deep lines carved around her mouth. Something about her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Excuse me, honey," she called, her voice carrying an affected sweetness that immediately put me on edge. "My daughter and I just got into town to visit family and we're in a bit of a situation." I stopped walking but maintained distance from the car, conscious of Ray watching from his position near the store. The woman continued without waiting for my response. "We're completely out of gas and I left my wallet at my sister's house." She gestured vaguely in some direction. "We don't have any money to get to her place. Could you possibly spare a few dollars? Just enough for a gallon or two to get us there?" It was a common enough scam and one I'd heard before. I shifted my weight, clutching my keys tighter. "I'm sorry," I said, not stepping any closer. "I don't carry cash." It was the truth. I never did, especially when working late shifts. The woman's smile faltered for just a second before returning, wider and more desperate. "That's okay, sweetheart," she said quickly, too quickly. "Maybe you could help us another way. We just need to get to the gas station down the road. If you could hop in with us, we could drive there together, and you could pay for a little gas with your card. $10 is all we need." Every instinct in my body was screaming danger. The woman's request was wildly inappropriate, asking a stranger to get into their car after midnight. But it wasn't just the request that unnerved me. It was how frantically she made it, how her eyes darted between me and something inside the car, how her knuckles had whitened where she gripped the steering wheel. That's when I noticed the girl in the passenger seat. She was a teenager, maybe 16 or 17, with pale skin and limp blonde hair falling across her face. But while the woman was all nervous energy and desperate smiles, the girl was unnaturally still. She hadn't turned to look at me or acknowledged the conversation in any way. She just sat there, staring straight ahead with an intensity that made my skin crawl. As I watched, unable to look away, the girl slowly turned her head toward me. Her movements were mechanical, like a doll being rotated by unseen hands. When her eyes finally met mine, I felt a chill despite the summer heat. There was nothing behind those eyes. No emotion, no recognition, not even the desperate hunger I saw in her mother's gaze. Just empty, glassy orbs reflecting the parking lot lights. And then, with deliberate slowness, she began to lick her lips, her tongue making a complete circuit, while her fingers began to twist and ring together in her lap. The message was clear. I was not looking at someone who needed help. I was looking at a predator. "No," I said firmly, already backing away. "I can't help you." The woman's face hardened instantly, the pretense of friendliness evaporating like morning dew. "It would only take 5 minutes," she insisted, her voice now tinged with something closer to a command than a request. "Just get in the car." I turned and ran back toward the store, acutely aware that they had pulled up behind my car, effectively blocking me from escaping that way. Ray was already moving toward us, his hand resting on something at his hip, perhaps a weapon from his police days. The car's engine roared as they accelerated away, tires squealing on the asphalt as they sped out of the parking lot. Ray reached me, concern etched across his weathered face. "You okay? What did they want?" I explained the encounter, my voice shaking more than I wanted to admit. Ray's expression grew increasingly grim as I described the vacant-eyed girl and her ritualistic lip-licking. "You did the right thing," he said, walking me back to the store to call the police. "Those two have been spotted at several shopping centers in the county. Last week, they tried the same routine with a girl at the mall. She got in their car." My blood ran cold. "What happened to her?" Ray looked away, focusing on something in the distance. "She got lucky. Managed to jump out at a red light when she realized they weren't heading toward any gas station. Broke her arm in the fall, but it could have been much worse." He didn't need to elaborate on what worse might have entailed. The police took my statement but didn't sound optimistic about catching them. "They move around a lot," the officer explained. "Different counties, different states. By tomorrow, they could be in Virginia or Tennessee." That night, as I drove home, with Ray following in his car until I reached my apartment complex, I couldn't shake the image of that girl's empty eyes, the mechanical motion of her tongue, the methodical writhing of her fingers. I wondered if she had once been like me, a student, a daughter, someone with hopes and dreams, before whatever darkness consumed her took hold. I quit the night shift the next day. Some risks aren't worth the extra $1 an hour. Years later, long after I'd graduated and moved to another state, I saw a news story about a mother and daughter arrested in Florida for human trafficking. The details were sparse, but the reporter mentioned their method: approaching young women in parking lots with stories about needing gas money or help, getting them into their car, and then the report cut to commercial before finishing. I never saw their faces in the news footage, never confirmed if it was the same pair from that night in North Carolina. But sometimes, when I find myself alone in a parking lot after dark, I still hear the crunch of tires on asphalt, still feel the weight of that empty gaze falling on me like a physical touch, and I run. Story 7. Working the night shift. The Barton building was never meant to be occupied at night. During daylight hours, it functioned like any other corporate office. Fluorescent lights humming overhead, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, the occasional burst of laughter from the break room. But after 7 p.m., when the last of the day shift employees filed out, the building transformed. The automatic lights would shut off floor by floor, leaving only the dim emergency bulbs that cast long, distorted shadows across empty cubicles. The heating system would power down to minimal levels, causing the metal infrastructure to contract and expand with eerie groans and clicks that echoed through vacant corridors. I knew these sounds intimately. The night shift was the only option that worked with my schedule, a necessity rather than a choice. 4 nights a week, from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m., I occupied the marketing department on the 14th floor, alone with the building's nocturnal symphony. At first, the solitude was unnerving. I'd jump at every creak, every distant thud of the ancient plumbing system. But after a month, I'd grown accustomed to the building's particular language. I could distinguish between the normal settling noises and the occasional visit from the cleaning crew 3 floors below. I even came to appreciate the quiet. No supervisors hovering over my shoulder, no office politics to navigate. Just me, my work, and the gentle hum of my computer. Until that Friday night in February. It was around 2 a.m., that peculiar hour when the world outside seems to hold its breath, when even the most dedicated night owls have retired and early risers haven't yet stirred. I was deep into a marketing analysis report, my fingers flying across the keyboard, my desk lamp creating a small island of light in the darkened floor. The sound came without warning, a sharp crack like splintering wood, originating somewhere beyond the boundaries of my cubicle. I froze, fingers suspended above the keys, listening intently. The building had its noises, yes, but this was different. Closer, somehow, and more deliberate. After several seconds of silence, I dismissed it as another of the building's mysterious sounds and resumed typing. Perhaps a drawer had finally succumbed to gravity in one of the abandoned cubicles, or a forgotten book had slid from a desk. Then came the second sound, unmistakable and impossible to rationalize away, the distinctive electronic chime of a computer starting up. My breath caught in my throat. I was supposed to be alone on this floor. Security had verified it when I signed in, as they did every night. The nearest occupied floor was at least 3 levels down, where the overnight cleaning crew worked their slow progression through the building. I stood cautiously, rising on my tiptoes to peer over the cubicle walls. The floor plan was a maze of identical gray partitions, stretching in every direction. But there, on the opposite side of the floor, I could see the telltale blue glow of a monitor illuminating the darkness. Someone was here. Common sense told me it was probably another employee, perhaps pulled into an unexpected night shift like myself. Yet the hairs on the back of my neck stood at attention, a primal warning system that predated rational thought. "Hello?" I called out, my voice embarrassingly unsteady. "Is someone there?" The response was immediate and chilling. The blue glow vanished, plunging that section of the floor back into darkness. Not the gradual dimming of a computer being properly shut down, but the sudden blackness of a monitor being switched off. Whoever was there didn't want to be seen. I dropped back down, heart hammering against my ribs. The rational part of my brain offered explanations. Maybe it was the cleaning crew coming to this floor early. Maybe it was security doing an unexpected patrol. Maybe it was another night worker who valued their privacy. But none of these explanations accounted for the silence that followed my call, or the deliberate way the monitor had been extinguished. I reached for my phone, intending to call security, then hesitated. What exactly would I say? That I'd seen a computer screen? That I was spooked by an unidentified colleague? They'd think I was being ridiculous. Instead, I made what may have been the stupidest decision of my life. I decided to investigate. First, I turned off my own desk lamp and computer monitor, plunging my cubicle into darkness. Better not to advertise my location. Then, moving as quietly as possible, I crouched low and began making my way toward the elevators, keeping close to the cubicle walls for cover. The office floor was eerily silent now, no clicks of keyboards or hums of machinery. Just the sound of my own controlled breathing and the soft pad of my sneakers on the industrial carpet. I paused at each intersection of cubicles, listening for movement before continuing my cautious progress. I had almost reached the elevator bay when I spotted it. A shadow darker than the surrounding darkness, crouched behind a large potted plant near the stairwell door. A human silhouette, unnaturally still, clearly trying to remain hidden. The figure was dressed entirely in black, their features indistinguishable in the low light. But there was something about their posture, a coiled tension, like a predator waiting to spring, that sent ice water coursing through my veins. This was no colleague working late. This was someone who had no business being here. I froze, afraid even to breathe, my mind racing through options. The elevators were closer, but the chime and light when they arrived would immediately give away my position. The stairwell was my best escape route, but the shadowy figure was positioned right beside it. With excruciating slowness, I began to back away, intending to circle around to the opposite stairwell on the other side of the floor. I'd made it perhaps 3 steps when my hip bumped against a desk, sending a pen rolling to the floor with a sound that seemed deafening in the silence. The shadow moved, shifting position slightly, but didn't pursue me. They hadn't pinpointed my location yet. I abandoned stealth for speed, turning toward the far stairwell and moving as quickly as I dared without making noise. When I reached the door, I pushed it open with deliberate casualness, as if I were simply a worker headed home for the night, unaware of any danger. The heavy fire door closed behind me with a soft click, and I stood for a moment in the concrete stairwell, listening. No sound of pursuit yet. I began descending, maintaining a measured pace, counting floors in my head. I had gone down perhaps 2 flights when I heard it, the crash of the stairwell door being flung open above me, followed by the rapid thunder of footsteps. Not the measured tread of someone simply using the stairs, but the frantic pace of pursuit. Panic surged through me, obliterating caution. I took the stairs 3 at a time, nearly falling several times, the slap of my shoes on concrete echoing upward. Above me, the footsteps accelerated, gaining ground with every second. By some miracle, I reached the ground floor without breaking my neck. I burst through the stairwell door into the lobby, startling the night security guard at his desk. "Someone's in the building," I gasped, pointing at the stairwell door as it swung closed behind me. 14th floor. They chased me. The guard was on his feet instantly, radio in hand, calling for backup. He positioned himself between me and the stairwell, one hand moving to the weapon at his hip. "Stay behind me," he instructed, his voice calm but alert. We waited, tension coiling tighter with each passing second, but the stairwell door remained closed. No pursuer emerged. When 2 additional security officers arrived minutes later, they conducted a floor-by-floor search of the building, starting with the 14th floor. They found no one. No unauthorized personnel, no evidence of forced entry, nothing out of place except for my abandoned workstation. "Are you sure you saw someone?" the head of security asked, his tone gentle but skeptical. "Working nights can play tricks on your mind, the isolation, the odd hours." "I know what I saw," I insisted, though doubt had begun to creep in. Had I imagined the blue glow of the monitor? Had the shadow by the stairwell been just that? A shadow, distorted by fear and dim lighting? But then how to explain the footsteps that had pursued me down the stairs? The security footage from the stairwell cameras would surely show my pursuer. Except it didn't. The cameras captured me entering the stairwell on the 14th floor, descending in obvious panic and exiting on the ground level. But there was no one behind me, no dark figure, no pursuit. Just a woman running from nothing. My boss arranged for me to switch to day shifts after that incident. He cited concern for my well-being, but I caught the sidelong glances from colleagues, heard the whispered conversations that stopped when I approached. The night shift girl who cracked under the pressure, the one who imagined prowlers in the empty building. 6 months later, I took a job at another company. On my last day, as I was packing my desk, the head of security stopped by. "I always wanted to ask you," he said, leaning against my cubicle wall. "What made you run that night? What did you think you saw?" I studied his face, looking for signs of mockery, but found only genuine curiosity. "I saw someone hiding near the stairwell," I said simply, "dressed all in black, watching me." He nodded thoughtfully. "You know what's strange? 3 months after your incident, they installed new security cameras on all the floors, higher resolution, better coverage." "That's good," I said, uncertain where he was going with this. "The thing is," he continued, lowering his voice, "twice now the night guard has reported seeing someone on the 14th floor after hours. Someone who shouldn't be there. but when they send someone up to check, the floor's always empty. He straightened, adjusting his tie. Anyway, good luck at your new position. As he walked away, I felt a cold certainty settle in my bones. Whatever, or whoever, had been in the Barton building that night wasn't gone. They were still there, moving through the darkness when no one was watching, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And sometimes, late at night in my new apartment, I wake to the sound of footsteps approaching my bedroom door, soft but deliberate, and I lie perfectly still, barely breathing as the doorknob slowly begins to turn.